Hi, everybody. So am I here? Am I live?
Am I live?
Hello. I see a hello from India. I see a thumbs up. Just thank you all for being here. I'm so excited to be here. This is my first YouTube live as a solo event. So please be patient with me if I have some technological issues. And you might see me sometimes looking at my phone. I'm not checking my messages. I'm communicating with Kirsten from Tergar because I can't really read your chat box well, but she can send me. But I did look at the chat box a little bit before we started, and I saw that we had people here from all over the world, and I even recognize a couple names. So thank you for coming on a weekend. I know if you're coming to a parenting program, you probably have kids. So I really appreciate seeing you. And I'm going to go through a presentation, but I love the Zoom, and this isn't Zoom, actually, this is YouTube Live. But one of the things that I love about these technologies is they do allow us to interact with people all over the world. So please feel comfortable putting something in the chat box, and then I will get us something on my phone, and I will do my best to respond. Okay. So with that in mind, I don't know about you, but I am spending a lot of time on Zoom these days, and so is pretty much everyone in my universe. And one of the things I try to do before starting something online is to just kind of center and ground myself. So how about we do that together? How about we just gather our attention right here, right now? Take a few deliberate breaths if that's helpful to you. Maybe you're more comfortable listening to the sounds around you. But just take a moment to feel the crown of your head. You can imagine that you've got a knit cap and you're pulling it down over the top of your head, over your forehead, over the back of your head to your ears. See if you can just feel that for a second. Move your attention to around your eyes. See if just moving your attention to around your eyes softens. Bring your attention to your face and your jaw. To your shoulders. If your shoulders are yanked up, you can lower them. To your back, to your upper arms, your elbows, your lower arms, your wrists and your hands. If you like, you can put one hand on your chest over your heart like this. And feel the breath. Move that hand up and down. Up and down. Now, if you like, just bring that hand down to your tummy. And feel your breath move the hand up and down. Up and down. Now rest that hand back easy on your lap. And if you're sitting, feel your seat in the chair. Feel your upper legs, your knees, your lower legs, your ankles, your feet and your toes. Now for just a moment, let's rest right here, right now, in this moment. Not going to try to block anything that comes to mind. Not try to change anything. Not do anything at all. Just bring awareness to how it feels to be right here, right now, using this technology to connect with people from all over the world, to talk about how to be a parent and how to care with wisdom and compassion. When you're ready, you can wiggle your fingers, move around a bit, wiggle your toes, and maybe you can see some ways that you could practice something like that at home or at school with the kids that are in your life. Now, the title of this program is Caring with Wisdom and Compassion. But one of the things that we're really talking about here is whether being helpful is whether being helpful is always helpful. I don't know about you, but I know myself as a parent or as another caregiver that often in my effort, in my attempt, in my well-intentioned hope that I'm going to be helpful, I sometimes get over my skis and my attempts at fixing or my attempts at helping actually backfire. I don't know if that happens to you, but it certainly has happened to me an awful lot. So in the beginning part of this talk, I want to talk a little bit about what that's about. What's happening in our minds and bodies that happens where with the best of intention, where when we are connected to that natural goodness, to that natural wisdom, compassion, and awareness that's inside all of us, we don't need to develop it. We don't need to cultivate it. It's already there. So why, if we have that, do sometimes we get over our skis, and why aren't we helpful? So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about Mingyur Rinpoche's 4-step process for working with emotions, especially strong ones, and how we can use that 4-step process in real life. So in order to do this, we need to know a little bit about the nervous system, just a little bit of a nervous system primer. So let's get started on that. I don't know how many of you have heard of an arousal curve, but it goes like this, something like this. And in this curve, when we are at the top of the curve, remember it's like a hump on the back of a camel. When we're at the top, we are at our optimum. We are open, we're receptive, we're ready to learn. And that's just terrific. That is when our capacity to meet whatever is happening right now meets up with whatever is happening right now. Or maybe our capacity is greater. Maybe this is the incoming. Maybe this is the nervous system incoming right now. We have a higher capacity. We're able to hold all of this in balance. And so then we're up at the top of that curve. But what happens when the nervous system stimulation, when the activation, when the things that are really causing us stress actually scoot up beyond our capacity into this area? Here's our capacity for what we can handle in balance, and here is where all the incoming is. What happens? Well, remember that curve that's like the hump on a camel. We slip off to one side or the other. We either slip into something known as fight or flight, or we slip into freeze. Now, when we talk to kids about this, we talk to them about their nervous system as being like an inner watchdog. It's there for a very good reason. It's there as a survival mechanism. But the problem with our inner watchdog is that sometimes it gets things wrong. When our inner watchdog thinks that we're in danger, when our inner watchdog thinks that we're in trouble, then what happens? It moves into fight, flight, or freeze. And when that happens, that's a necessary and helpful survival instinct. When that happens, our bandwidth goes from wide, where we're open, receptive, and ready to learn, to something far, far more narrow. What happens with that narrow bandwidth? When that narrow bandwidth happens, then we are really focused in on what we think is scaring us. We're focused in on what we need to do to survive. And that's a really good thing if we actually are in a jungle and a tiger is chasing us. Or it's a terrific, terrific thing if we take our hand and we put it in the flame accidentally. Then we don't stop and think about, should I take my hand out of the flame? No, we just pull it out. That's why the narrow bandwidth is so very helpful. But what happens sometimes is that narrow bandwidth doesn't allow us to see the full picture. And one way that scientists, and also that Mingyur Rinpoche talks about this, is he talks about it in terms of something called a negativity bias. And a negativity bias, again, is a very helpful survival mechanism. What it means is that when we are faced with something that inner watchdog, that's how we talk about it with kids, that inner watchdog is frightened by, is scared by, it thinks it's threatened by, that inner watchdog gets us to focus narrowly on the danger. Well, this, again, is really handy when we need to focus narrowly on danger. But the problem is that we tend not to then see the whole picture. So what we do is we try to broaden our perspective to include not just the bad stuff that's going on, not just the worries, but also the good things that are happening too. This is especially true now during COVID, when so many of us are staying home, and when our kids are staying home, and when there are things that we are worried about and things that we not only have no control over, but really just don't know what's going to happen next. We really have to work at it to combat this survival mechanism we have, to hone in on the stuff that scares us so that we can relax a little bit in our minds and body to include it all. So what happens when we can relax in our minds and bodies is that our bandwidth again gets wider, and that's what we're trying to do. So when our bandwidth is wider, we're able to do a couple of things. And one of the things we're able to do with this wide, infinite bandwidth is we're able to connect, to really connect deep down to these qualities that Mingyur Rinpoche talks about so often, and he talks about on these Sunday videos that he's doing, which I really recommend. They're terrific. And these qualities are qualities like awareness, wisdom, compassion, and love. These qualities are inside all of us. They don't need to be developed. They don't need to be cultivated. But what we do need to sometimes develop and cultivate is the capacity to recognize them, is the capacity to tap into them, especially when emotions are running high. When we do, when we're able to tap into these innate qualities of awareness, clarity, wisdom, and compassion, when we can do that, we're then better able to look at the scary things in our lives, whether they're scary emotions or whether they're scary incoming things that are happening in the world. But with a wider bandwidth, we're able to look at them with more of a sense of curiosity and more of an understanding that they are going to come and go. More of an understanding of this view that Mingyur Rinpoche talks about so often, about impermanence and how life is like an ocean and that there are ups and downs and ups and downs. Tough to see that broad perspective when our bandwidth is narrow because our nervous systems are all jacked up. But the good news is that there are mindfulness-based and meditation-based strategies that help us notice when we're starting to get constricted in our minds and bodies, and help us then relax and build a more spacious bandwidth, one big enough to include both the difficulties and the good, and also our bodies tend to relax as well. So how do we get from here, that narrow, scared bandwidth, where our survival mechanism is taking care of us by focusing in on what we think is dangerous, to this wider, more spacious bandwidth where indeed we don't ignore the difficulties, but we're able to also see the broader picture and are better able to engage in critical thinking, to come up with solutions that are in our own best interest and the best interest of those around us. So, as I talked to you before, as I mentioned before, we're going to talk a little bit about Mingyur Rinpoche's 4-step process for handling emotions. And I want to tell you, many of you know me from my teaching capacity and from my going into schools and working with parents as the teacher. I want to tell you that I have a teacher too. I think it's important for absolutely all of us who are practicing meditation to have a teacher. I just can't recommend it highly enough. If you don't have one yet, somebody you consider to be a mentor, somebody who you consider a person who can teach you more about the basic principles of mindfulness and meditation and can help you along your way. I think everybody needs a teacher like that. And I'm lucky enough to have a teacher, and he's Mingyur Rinpoche. So I'm going to talk about his 4-step process for working with emotions. However, I'm talking about it as a student. So please know that I'm interpreting his teachings through my own lens the best I can. So it's my intention to give you his teachings, but they might not be exactly what he would say if he were here. So one of the things that we do, the first thing we do when we, in meditation, and then we're going to talk in a second about how these practices can be applied to family life outside of meditation. Rinpoche talks about two different things. There's a formal meditation, the meditation on the cushion, and there's an informal meditation, something we drop in throughout the day. So first, let's talk about the more formal practice and these first steps that Rinpoche talks about in handling, managing strong emotions. And the first step is just to watch them. Just to watch them. Now, in order to be able to watch them and not get tangled up in them and not get lost in them, it really is helpful to have this wider bandwidth. And when we're able to watch these emotions like that, we start to see that they are like an ocean. They rise and fall. They rise and fall. They rise and fall. They come and go. They're impermanent. They aren't really solid and substantial, although we often think that they are. So that's the first thing we do. We just watch the emotions. We sit with them. We're present with them. We be with them. In a way, we feel them. In a way, we feel these emotions without getting lost or tangled up in them. So that's the goal. But here's the hard thing. When those emotions are very, very strong, this can sometimes be hard to do. So that comes to the second step of the process. I see that Christine is texting me, so I want to make sure I don't need to get back to you about something here. Oh, we have some questions, and I'm going to get to those in a minute, I promise you. So the first step of the process is to watch the emotions, right? Sometimes we can't watch them without getting lost in them. So then here's something we do next. Then what we do is we move the primary attention, our primary attention, to a single object that's happening in the present moment. So that could be one of four things. It could be sound. It could be the feeling of breath. It could be a visualization, something we're picturing in our head, or it could be a phrase like, right now, I'm okay. Right now, everything is workable. Or phrases like counting breaths, just counting in, counting out every time you breathe, or just saying the words in, out every time you breathe. But let me talk more about what we mean when we say one of these four objects becomes your primary object of attention. That doesn't mean that we again recreate the phenomena I was talking about when our nervous system starts getting worked up by narrowing in our bandwidth and just focusing in on that one thing, just focusing in on the sound, just focusing in on the word. That's not what we do in this type of practice, in this type of tradition. We primarily focus on one of those four things: a sound, a picture in our head, the feeling of breathing, or a phrase. But we primarily focus on it much in the way we focus on the road ahead of us when we're driving. So I don't know how many of you drive, and I don't know how many of you have kids in the back seat of the car, but maybe you'll understand how I kind of tell this story. When I am driving, I'm mostly looking at the road ahead of me. That's where my primary focus is. But I don't block out what's happening on the side of the road. I keep an eye on what's happening with the pedestrians. And I also keep a general sense of what's happening in the back seat. And my kids are grown now, but when they were young, I would keep an eye out to make sure they weren't throwing French fries or something like that. So my primary focus would be on the sound in the case of sound, or on the feeling of breathing in the case of breathing, or on a phrase, maybe in, out, or on a picture in my head, maybe an image of a place where I feel very happy and I feel very content and satisfied. But I wouldn't be blocking out the other things that are happening in my mind. We try not to interfere with that. We just don't want to get tangled up and lost in those things. So that's the second step in this four-step process for managing emotions. One of the things we do with kids, though, and with sometimes in settings where we're working with doctors or mental health professionals, there is a particular process where we do focus on one thing and ignore distractions. And this is especially true with young children who don't yet have the developmental capacity to be able to hold on to this broad space of awareness and be able to hold all of the different things coming up in their mind at the same time. They need to focus on one thing and ignore distractions. And we show kids about this nervous system with something like a snow globe. So let me show you how this works. When the snow globe was still, you could see through the water. You could see all the way through to the other side. But now all of that snow is stirred up, and we think of that snow as thoughts or emotions or stress. And when it's stirred up like this, look, we can't see to the other side. So it's tough to make decisions when we don't really know what's happening because the snow is because the snow is blocking our perspective. But if we stop, if we feel our breathing, let's focus primarily on the breathing, or focus on watching that snow settle. Look, the snow settles, and then take a look. Can you see through now? Yeah, we can see through. So we can see now what's happening in around us, where when all the stress or strain is busy in our minds, when we're thinking about it or ruminating or engaged in it, then sometimes our minds get like this. They're so cloudy, we just can't see clearly. So now we have that first or the second step that Mingyur Rinpoche talks about. We just watch these, we stay with them, we watch them settle until our mind clears, and then we can see what's happening clearly. We can see through the mind. Two important points about this that we tell kids, though. One is, did the snow go away? No, the snow doesn't go away. Unfortunately, if the snow is the stress and strain or the challenges in our lives, mindfulness doesn't make it go away entirely. But what it does do is it gives us a strategy to help that settle a bit so we can see clearly and make choices that are in our own best interests and also the best interests of other people. One other thing I really want to point out about the snow globe. Sometimes people get confused and think mindfulness is about blanking out your mind or meditation, and it's about getting rid of thoughts. And kids especially can very quickly think that demonizes thoughts and that thoughts are bad. We don't want that, or emotions are bad. We're not trying to put a wet blanket on thoughts and emotions that come up. So we show them the snow in the snow globe. And we point out how pretty it is, right? This is really beautiful stuff. And the activity in our minds is kind of like that too. The activity in our minds, the thoughts and the emotions and the ideas, they can be really, really beautiful. But even that kind of excitement, even that kind of creativity and engagement can sometimes get so busy that it clouds our perspective. So even beautiful thoughts, even beautiful emotions, we want them. We love the creativity, but sometimes it's helpful to have strategies to help settle our mind so that we can see through and see clearly and get to the other side and solve problems. So that's how we talk to kids about those ideas that I was telling you before about watching the activity of our mind or focusing primarily on a particular object in the moment, whether that's sound, whether that's your breath, whether that's a word or a phrase, or whether that's a picture in your head. So the next step, the third step, which is a step we don't do with kids, but it's a step that Mingyur Rinpoche talks about in dealing with emotions, is that if we still feel overwhelmed, even after observing, and then even after primarily focusing on one of those four objects of attention, if we still feel overwhelmed, if we still feel we can't contain the incoming. Remember, we talked about already that we have a capacity to deal with incoming. However, when that incoming is less or meets the capacity, terrific. Then we're at the top of that arousal curve. We're open, we're receptive, we're ready to learn and to listen. When that incoming goes above our capacity, up to here, well, that's when we go into something that's more toxic. And so when that happens, then it's time to try another technique. And the technique that Mingyur Rinpoche suggests then is that we actually look at something called a booster emotion. What's behind the emotions that are coming up right now? And in the last Sunday video, I think it was the last one he did, he talked about desire and aversion. We want something or we don't want something. And how they are like they're like two pedals in a car. So it's either the brake to stop, that's when we don't want something, or it's like the gas pedal that makes us go faster. And that's like when we do want something. So if we're looking at these strong emotions and they still feel overwhelming to us, sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's helpful to dig a little deeper and see, well, what's really behind there? And often what's behind there is that we either want something, and that something is often connected to those qualities of love and kindness and wisdom and compassion inside us. Often that want is just, we want our family to be safe and happy. And sometimes what's behind whatever is that strong emotion, maybe it's anger, maybe what's behind it is fear, which is we don't want something. And that again is connected to these qualities of love and kindness and compassion. We're afraid something's going to happen and we don't want that to happen. So those are sometimes the fuel. They're like boosters for these strong emotions we're already having, and they make them even stronger. Sometimes looking at it in that perspective, seeing what's fueling these emotions can again help us settle and help us get back to where the incoming meets our capacity. Sometimes, though, we still are feeling a little bit overwhelmed. And when that happens, you get to the fourth suggestion from Mingyur Rinpoche on handling these strong emotions, and it's take a break. And I have to tell you, I think this may be one of the most important suggestions right now for families, for kids with COVID. And we don't, especially when we are in the process of family life, not during formal sitting meditation practice. Sometimes when things start to get just a little bit too worked up, a little bit too hot, a little too emotional, the best thing to do is to take a break. And when we take a break, there are ways we can take a break that also help to manage the nervous system. One of those ways is through movement, and through gentle movement, controlled movement, especially movement where we where we move between some moving and some grounding activity. Maybe we take a walk, a mindful walk. Maybe we do some shaking practices, which we do a lot of shaking practices with kids, where we shake a little bit and then we settle and breathe. And we shake a little bit and we shake out that speedy energy, that nervous speedy energy, and we settle. And this shaking practice is something that I learned from Mingyur Rinpoche's brother, Soni Rinpoche, who's another wonderful teacher. This shaking practice of letting the nervous energy go, letting that speedy energy go, is also really useful in meditation. You just shake. If you're having a hard time sitting for a second, and then you just settle back in and ground yourself in the feeling of breathing. And so we go back and forth between the moving and the grounding activity a few times, and that helps us build resilience. If you'd like to learn more about that idea, you can also take a look at Peter Levine's book, Trauma Proofing Your Child. Another thing we can do when we take a break as a way to help regulate is get outside if we can and just connect with the natural world around us. And we can also, another great self-regulating strategy is co-regulation, where we connect with somebody else. Remember, anxiety is contagious. So if we're feeling anxious, that's a contagious feeling, and it can pass on very quickly to our children and to our partners and to those around us. So that can feel like a lot of responsibility until we remember being grounded and being settled. Well, that's contagious too. So when we're grounded and when we're settled, that too can connect with, can have a ripple effect into our families, to our kids, to our partners, to all those around us, to help them become more grounded and more settled too. So all of these strategies are in a very real way connecting with our present moment experience. Remember, we're primarily focusing on the present moment. We're not blocking what else is going on. We're not denying the difficulties in our lives, but we're moving our primary attention to the present moment. And when we do that, we can ground ourselves without people even really knowing it. So if family life is chaotic, make yourself a cup of tea, pick up the tea, and just hold it in your hands. Really settle in and feel the cup of tea. Other thoughts and emotions can come up, but don't try to engage in them. Don't try to analyze them. Don't try to solve the problems right now. Instead, just feel the cup in your hand. And that's a way of settling even when everything around us is anything but settled. When we are settled, we have that broader bandwidth, right? When we are settled, we have that broader bandwidth, right? And with that broader bandwidth, we're able to reflect and we're able to think about some of these primary themes that we learn through the practice of mindfulness and meditation. And one of the themes that is extremely important right now, especially during COVID, is this theme of not knowing. We just don't know what's going to happen next. In fact, we couldn't possibly know all the causes and conditions that led to this very moment. Sometimes that's a hard idea to land and to figure out. But if you think just for 1 second, it is a statistical improbability that we're all here today. If you're on the call and I'm on the call and there's other people on the call chatting in the chat box, the likelihood that all of us would be doing that right here, right now is really improbable. Why? Because just one thing needed to go wrong in one of our universes and the situation wouldn't be the same. Let's say your internet hadn't worked today, so you weren't able to get online here. Then it wouldn't be the same situation. I might be here, some of the people in the chat box might be here, but you wouldn't be, so the entire system would be different. Just one element in a system changes, the whole system changes a bit. So that may seem like a heady concept, and it might even seem like, oh, who wants to think about that? But I have to tell you, through the process of a formal meditation practice, and I was a lawyer before I did what I do now, working with parents and kids, and I certainly have my control freak tendencies, and I sure like to fix things, and I sure can get out over my skis trying to fix things out of reactivity, as opposed to from this broader, more spacious perspective where I can tie into or tap in to the wisdom and the compassion and the clarity inside. But as a fixer, I was very, very surprised to find out that when I truly became comfortable with not knowing, when I truly became comfortable with the idea that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't know all of the factors I would need to know in order to solve any problem or to know what happened before this situation or what would happen next. When I actually became comfortable with that, it was a tremendous relief. And what happened is I went from that more constricted, narrow bandwidth that happens when we get scared, when we're afraid of something, because it's a survival instinct, it's a healthy instinct, to a more open bandwidth where I was able to relax in the not knowing. Now, you guys might be thinking, that sounds great, but how do you possibly get that idea across to kids? And there's simple games we play with the kids to help them understand that. One is we use an image where we have two birds. We use a lot of birds in our classes looking at a 6, and the 6 is on the ground. And the 6 is sideways. And one of the birds is looking at it from the perspective that it looks like a 9. And the other one is looking at it from the perspective that it looks like a 6. Well, if the bird that is standing in such a way that this figure on the ground looks like a 6, sees a 6, and the bird that is standing so that that same figure looks like a 9, which one's right and which one's wrong? It really depends on where you're standing. So we can show kids that picture and explain that idea, and they start to get this idea that we really can't know all of the sides to every story. Part of the story really depends on where we're standing and what we actually see. We tell that story again and we teach that lesson again by showing children a drawing that looks like both a duck and a rabbit. And we say, is it a duck or is it a rabbit? Some kids say it's a duck. Other people say it's a rabbit. Is it possible that it's both? If you think it's a duck, are you wrong? If you think it's a rabbit, are you right? Or is it possible that sometimes one thing can be more than one thing at a time? Again, a way of showing kids that there are many, many sides to a story and that everything is not always binary. Everything is not always black and white. And that comfort level with this more open perspective is one of the real gifts of this practice of formal and informal meditation. It really helps move us more to an understanding that the world is complex and many-factored, and sometimes what we know or what we believe largely depends on where we stand or what our experience is. I don't know if you know the story about the 6 blind people and the elephant, but that's a great example of we're limited in what we see and what we know based on what we see. So in this example, a big elephant comes to town and that there's 6 blind people who come up and each person touches a different part of the elephant. And when he or she does, then they think the elephant is something different. One person touches a leg and puts his hands around the leg and thinks, oh, this elephant is a tree trunk. Another person touches the nose of the elephant and says, oh, it's a hose because of the long elephant nose. Another person touches the tusks and they're sharp and pointy. Oh, it's a spear. Somebody touches the tail. It's a rope. Somebody touches the side. It's a wall. And you see how every one of these people is touching something and making the best guess they can based on the information they have. That's all we can ask of ourselves. But they don't see the whole picture. So that's another way we help kids understand this broader perspective that is developed in a visceral way, a felt sense that's developed through the practice of mindfulness and meditation, either more formal practice or by dropping brief moments of awareness in throughout the day. So there's other ways we talk to kids about mindfulness too. One is we just talk to them about paying attention with kindness and curiosity to ourselves, to other people, and the world around us. So we bring this friendly attention to whatever's happening. And we talk to them about how mindfulness is a little bit like the reflection in a pond when the pond is still and clear. When a pond is still and clear, we can look over and we can see a reflection. And that's all we see. There's nothing coming back at us from that reflection than what's actually there. And that's what mindfulness is like. It's just the reflection of what's happening in our mind and body without additional layers that we add on to it through our thinking or our emotions. So those are ways we talk to kids about mindfulness. We practice mindfulness with kids in a way very similar to how Mingyur Rinpoche suggests adults practice mindfulness, which is we play games, activity-based mindfulness or mindful games. We play those games and we play them for brief periods of time frequently. We drop them into our routine, into what we're already doing, in the carpool line, while we're waiting at lunch, while we're at the dinner table, before bedtime. Just a simple mindful game, some activity-based mindfulness dropped into our routine makes it easy to integrate these ideas without it being just another piece of homework for us, for busy parents and busy teachers to add on to what's already pretty stressful time. One of the sets of mindful games that we play are appreciation games, games where we notice the good things in life. Now, this is also a very important aspect of Mingyur Rinpoche's teaching is appreciation. And with appreciation games, it's very important for us and for our kids that we remember the idea of these games is not to pretend the bad stuff doesn't exist. The first thing we do in an appreciation game is we acknowledge if something's hard. Hey, buddy, I'm really sorry. That's tough. So we acknowledge the difficulty, but remember what we were talking earlier and what Mingyur Rinpoche teaches a lot about. He talks about this negativity bias. Remember that bias is it's a survival instinct. It's good we have it, but we narrow down our focus and we focus more on what scares us, what we are worried about. And in so doing, we often lose sight of the big picture. So the appreciation games, we acknowledge the difficulty, we don't pretend that's not real, and we encourage kids to broaden their bandwidth to include some of the good things too. So I'm sorry, but that's really disappointing that happened. We're all stuck inside right now, and you're not able to go and see your friends. I'm really, really sorry that's difficult. Acknowledge the difficulty first. Give it a break, and then say something like, is there something good happening too, though? We know there's some bad, but can we notice some good things right now? I'm really enjoying this extra time with you at home. I'm really enjoying the feeling of the sun on my face. I'm really enjoying the feeling of the grass against my toes, that sort of thing. So we notice, we acknowledge the difficulty, and then we relax and try to broaden the perspective to include some good too. There's other things we do with kids to help them understand the discernment that we're trying to learn ourselves so that we act more out of a place of responsiveness than reactivity. That's the helpfulness thing, right? Sometimes we are trying to be helpful, but because it's coming from a place of reactivity, we actually aren't very helpful at all. So that happens with action, and it also happens with speech. So how do you teach that to kids? Well, we need to give them some really concrete ideas about how to figure out whether what they're about to say or do is actually wise, compassionate, kind. And one of the activities we play is the 3 or the 4 gates. Sometimes we use 3 gates, sometimes we use 4 gates. And before you're about to say something, you just ask yourself, is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? And the 4th gate is it the right kind? I'm sorry, is it the right time? Not is it the right kind? Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? And is it the right time? If we're able to pass through those 4 gates, then we know, okay, so I can go ahead and say this thing. Now, we don't ask ourselves these 4 questions every time we open our mouths and want to have a conversation. But I bet you have had, and your kids have had, plenty of times where you had a funny feeling somewhere that you were about to say something that may not be so skillful. If that's the case, that's when we use that about to moment, that moment when we're about to do something, but we still have a chance to pause and reassess, to ask ourselves these questions. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? And is it the right time? We do the same thing with actions. With actions, the questions are a little different. Just, is it helpful to me? Is it helpful to other people? And is it helpful to the community at large and the planet? And this is really important for all kinds of kids and for all kinds of personalities. We do know that there are people who will stop with, is it helpful to me? And if the answer is yes, then they say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that. We know that that's a case. But I have to tell you, my work is almost entirely with families, and especially with caregivers, with parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, educators, clinicians. They tend not to be so self-involved in that way. They're more interested is it helpful to somebody else? So that's where they'll go. If I do this, will that help these other people? Will it help the planet? And then they don't factor in whether it's going to help themselves. That leads to kind of a deep sense of caregiving fatigue. And that's why all 3 questions are important. Is it helpful to me? Maybe the answer is no, but it is helpful to other people. And sometimes we'll make the decision to do this anyway, even though it's not so helpful to ourselves. But if we're tired, if we're exhausted, if we're running ourselves down, then maybe we need to prioritize ourselves a little more, take better care of ourselves, because by taking care of ourselves, we help others, and by taking care of others, we help ourselves. So there's no right or wrong answer to this. You'll figure it out through your own connection with your own awareness and wisdom and compassion. But this is the kind of sequence of questions that we can ask ourselves and that our kids can ask to learn about discernment and whether or not, and what kind of decisions will be the best for not just ourselves, but those around us. But there's a fourth question here too. It's that sneaky, is it the right time question. And I know in most households and in most classrooms and in most relationships, there are things that we call tug of wars, right? It's basically a control battle and two people are pulling on the same rope. And sometimes the more skillful approach in a tug of war, rather than pulling harder and trying to win, is to just let go of the rope. This is called the backwards law. And sometimes the harder we try, the less likely we are to succeed. Now, as parents, there's times where we just can't drop that rope. We have to scoop up a screaming child and put them in the back seat of a car in a car seat and buckle them in and get to where we need to go. But I have found in my own life, once I really started viscerally feeling from the inside out what this feels like, I have found that more often than I had ever imagined, it's just fine for me to drop the rope. And especially during this pandemic, this idea of, is it the right time, is a really important question. Yes, we want our children to eat well-rounded meals. However, right now, during this pandemic, when we're all stuck inside and there's lots of income coming in, maybe it's okay to eat only macaroni and cheese for a while if that's what our children want. Maybe it's not. Maybe that's not a good choice for your family, but just asking the question and thinking it through in this way can often be helpful. So I'm going to take a moment right now and take a look at these questions and see if we can answer some of these questions here. So I see here that Quinn wrote about, I have dealt with extreme anxiety since my early 20s. I have real difficult time managing my emotions. How can I go from being, that scared or fight or flight kid response to a more relaxed state? Well, remember that 4-step process. And it sounds like maybe you have tried watching your emotions. It sounds like maybe you have tried focusing primarily on one object in the present moment. If you haven't yet tried looking at the booster emotion, you could do that. But it seems like from your question, you have looked at the booster emotion because you're talking about being afraid. So sometimes at that point, it's helpful if you have that strong energy coming up, something we sometimes call speedy energy, is to move, is to actually move and not try to just sit still. And we can move during our formal meditation practice. If we're starting to feel a lot of speedy energy, but we don't want to just stop, we can certainly stop. We don't need to white knuckle through it. But if we don't want to stop, then if we want to see if we can continue for a while, then we don't need to stay seated or lying down. We can get up and we can practice some mindful walking, some movement. Remember, we talked a little bit about the shaking. Shaking's a great way to let go of some speedy energy and then settling. We can give ourselves a soothing touch. We can do our walking and be outside and connect with nature. It's still a bit of a break then, but it's moving from a formal practice into a more informal practice until those feelings that are swelling up inside us have an opportunity to get a little bit more spaciousness around them. So that's what I would suggest that you might want to try to start with. So let me see. So here's another question is, what's an exercise we can use when we're moody? Well, I think we just stay with the 4 steps that Rinpoche teaches. The first is just watch it. See if you can just watch the mood and see what happens by just observing it. Often, if we just observe what's happening And try not to get in there and muck around with it. Try not to get in there and think about it. What's the first thing that we observe? Often the first thing we observe is something that Rinpoche talks about as its impermanence. It's like a wave in an ocean, up and down, up and down. But he talks a lot. I really encourage you guys to be watching these Sunday videos, because in these Sunday videos, it's one of these peculiar silver linings of COVID. It's been such a gift that he's been teaching every week. In these Sunday videos, he's talking about a couple of things repeatedly. One is something called the waterfall effect. And what the waterfall effect means is that we often think that when lots of thoughts and emotions come up in meditation, something's not going right, something's going wrong. When in fact, as Rinpoche would say, he would put his finger up like this and he'd say, that's a good thing. It's a good sign when that happens. Why is it a good sign? Remember, we were talking about the pond early on and the glitter ball early on. When the mud in the pond is all muddy, it's like the snow and snow globe. You can't see through to the other side. When we practice these thoughts, these emotions, they don't go away entirely, remember, but they start to settle. And then we can see. And when we can see them, if you go back to this pond idea we have, when we can see them, we can see to the bottom of the pond and we can see, oh, there's an old shoe there. There's some old garbage. Oh, there's also some beautiful fish. And there's some lovely, lovely seaweed maybe. So we can see what's on the bottom of that pond that we really couldn't see before because the pond was muddy or the glitter or the snow, and the snow was like this. So when you start seeing that you're moody, I know that it might be something that you don't want to see, but actually let's reframe that a little bit. That's a good thing because it's the beginning of you seeing the thoughts and emotions. Remember, the goal of meditation is awareness. People often mistakenly believe that the goal of meditation is to get rid of thoughts, to change your experience. But Rinpoche teaches over and over and over again, the goal of meditation is awareness. What's one of the kind of magical qualities of awareness? One of the magical qualities of awareness is that once you're aware of something, it may not go away entirely. Just like the snow in the bottom of this snow globe, it doesn't go away, but your relationship to it changes. Once you're aware of something, it's no longer you're unconscious, you're aware of it, and in doing that, your relationship will change. I see some more questions here. So I hope that helped with the moodiness, but just follow those 4 steps. Are there any techniques to skillfully deal with the problem of contagion transmission of anxiety and agitation from one family member to another? Once again, this is a tough time. So we have to acknowledge that this is a tough time. One of the women that I work with, one of the teachers that I work with, jokes that we're all functioning with half a brain right now because we're on this nervous system overload. I mean, it's not true all the time, but it's a good way to think about this thing. So you may be stressed out. So that wide spacious bandwidth we have when we're at a point where our capacity to handle the incoming meets or is greater than what the incoming stress is here, that's when we have that wide open bandwidth. That's called healthy stress. That kind of adversity is actually good for kids. When kids have incoming that meets their capacity that they can handle, that's good for them. It's like working a muscle. It's like building a muscle in the gym skillfully. But when incoming is getting to be more than we can handle like this, then at that point, then we need to do something a little bit different. So if we notice that everybody's got incoming, and sometimes that incoming is acted out, some people act out that incoming differently. Some people, when they're feeling overwhelmed, go into fight or flight, right? They go into this place where they start, yelling or screaming or something like that. That's pretty easy to identify as nervous system overload. What we as caretakers often forget is that there's another way that people manifest this overload, and that's by shutting down And that can look like a lot of things. It can look like I'm tired. It can look like I'm bored. It can look like I don't care. It can look like this. And that's something that we very often miss and don't realize it's a sign from our child or our partner or ourselves that it's just a little too much stimulation. So, how do you deal with contagion in the family? How do you deal with these strong emotions in the family? It really goes back to awareness. We become aware of these really simple nervous system dynamics that are functioning within all of us all the time. They're survival mechanisms. We want to have them. These are not a bad thing, but we want to be able to work at it to help us to broaden our perspective when we can. So we're aware of what's happening, and then we remember this basic principle. Anxiety is contagious, but so is being grounded and centered. So if we're starting to feel worked up, and if we have young kids, just grab that glitter ball and say, Mommy's mind is feeling like this right now. Can you help me, please? And bring them into the conversation. You're modeling that you're aware that you're feeling worked up, and you're modeling on how you're trying to settle down together, and a beautiful cycle of co-teaching and co-learning happens. And when we have that broad bandwidth, we're better able to talk about these issues that you raised of contagion. Very, very tough to have the conversation about contagion when anybody's nervous system is all worked up and that bandwidth is not like this, but like this. I often joke that if I had known that when I was a young mom and had young kids and was a young wife, I now have, I've been married 30 years, but way back when, if I had understood that simple dynamic of the nervous system, they would have had a lot easier time than I had, and I would have had an easier time too. So just remembering that when people are worked up is not a time to be sorting through problems. That's a time to be grounding, to be regulating. And it doesn't mean we ignore the problems. It doesn't mean we pretend they don't exist. It's just we wait until we're settled and our bandwidth has gone like this to this, and then we can start having a conversation. I see we have more questions, but I also see that it's 12 o'clock and I want to be cautious about the time. So I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to everybody's questions, but it's 12 o'clock Pacific time. I know it's later Central time and later in Eastern time. So I'd just like to close with a moment of gratitude. For me, great gratitude for Mingyur Rinpoche, who's the teacher for this community, and for the opportunity to learn from him and for the way that he models for all of us. And also gratitude to all of you and all of you in this community, and for coming on out and trying to bring together a community that will support kids and families in these very, very difficult times. So thank you very much. And I think I'm going to end the stream now.